subject of this talk comes from my book, Everybody Needs Beauty, which I've just finished about 2 weeks ago. It's an 80,000 word book, and I tried to condense and kind of bring out some of the core themes of the book for this evening's talk, which is really hard, as you can imagine. So there's masses, obviously, I can't talk about. I'm just going to try to give a bit of a sense of why I wanted to write this book, and a bit of a flavour of some of the kind of cultural and historical stories that I tell in it. So to begin, nature has been tempting me away from cities, offices, and the comfort of my home for most of my life. It has always felt very natural to me to hunt out green places away from the mess and stress of work and life. I grew up reading books about nature, internalizing the belief that seeking nature was some kind of obligatory spiritual quest. From romantic poets, from the Brontes, I learnt to see my moods mirrored in nature, and I trained myself to be responsive to the subtle emotional influences of plants, animals, and weather. Literary landscapes became part of my own psychological landscape, giving shape to the messy and complicated emotions of growing up. But I grew up in the suburbs, just outside the M25. You could hear it all the time. So forests and mountains and wild places weren't really part of my daily reality. But I hunted for these wild places in well-trodden woodlands and the shattered mosaic of intensively ploughed fields that make up London's precarious green belt. I sought for them as testing grounds for the emotions I'd read about in books. And sometimes these slivers of nature made me feel better. Sometimes they gave me a place to be angry, lost, and confused. I never used to think about these trips as journeys for well-being, as some kind of medical cure. But 5 or 6 years ago, when I started this project, I found I was hearing about healing nature everywhere. Schools were taking their classrooms outdoors. Hospitals were being retrofitted with gardens and green spaces for patients to relax and unwind. Mental health charities were telling us to get outside, get our daily dose of nature, to find ways to switch off in forests and nature reserves. Natural consultants were selling wild excursions to business, promising that their workforce would become more productive, creative, and resilient. In the tiny Scottish archipelago of Shetland, I discovered it was possible to walk into a doctor's surgery with symptoms of anxiety or depression and walk out with a natural prescription, advice on how to connect with nature on Shetland's windswept shores. You're probably familiar with the experience of going to nature. This is when we're supposed to relax, unwind, breathe deeply, and switch off. The senses come to life again, and the ratcheting adrenaline that has been kind of kept us on the edge of panic begins to disperse in the blood. One of the signs that the Nature Cures revival is ongoing is the explosion of scientific interest in why this might happen. In 1984, the field biologist E.O. Wilson claimed that humanity's love for nature is innate, a product of millennia of evolution in which we lived with intimate relation with natural elements, creatures, and habitats. Wilson gave a name, biophilia, and a psychoevolutionary story to nature appreciation. And then other scientists stepped in with experiments designed to work out the mechanics. Volunteers were shown flashcards of green and blue spaces, and their responses captured. They were plugged into virtual environments, sent on walks by rivers, and frog marched down smoggy city roads. Blood samples were analysed, showing whether levels of the stress hormone cortisol had spiked or plummeted. Heart rates were monitored, showing whether levels of the stress, heart rates were monitored, and the subjects were asked to perform tricky maths tests to see if their thinking had become clearer or more fogged, depending on which environment they'd been in. Japanese scientists are now leading the way into research into phytonicides, compounds which leach from trees. And Belgium has emerged as a centre for research in therapeutic farming. There's no perfect way of measuring the effect nature has on us, but all these experiments seem to be pointing in the same direction. Living environments, landscapes of green and blue, can alter the way our minds and bodies work. So in my book, Everybody Needs Beauty, I set out on a series of journeys to explore this alteration, this transformation, by visiting places that across time and across cultures have been invested with the power to heal. I wanted to experience why. I wanted to experience them firsthand, plunging into sacred waters, bathing in the forest, and trying out experimental virtual reality natures designed to reproduce the effects of the outdoors inside. I didn't do this because I was in need of healing. There's a lot of nature writing books at the moment that follow this path of kind of a personal quest for healing in a certain environment and track that in the genre of the traditional nature memoir, but with elements of recovery memoir as well. I didn't do that in my book. And I didn't want to act as a PR person for the nature cure either. The scientific studies I was looking at were so well evidenced and extensive, it hardly seemed necessary to prove or disprove them. Certainly, I wanted to understand how places like forest baths or sacred springs are supposed to work. But more importantly, I wanted to ask, why is this revival happening now? What does it tell us about sickness and healing in a time of crisis? Being alive now means living through interconnected crises of mental health, social injustice, and environmental devastation, which are all terrible on their own and inextricably interlinked. Depression is one of the leading causes of disability worldwide, while most of the world lives under an economic system that is unjust, denying the majority the means to live with health, dignity, or in a flourishing environment. Decades of warnings about climate change have gone unheeded, as economic growth and the demands of polluting industries have been put before the survival of people and the planet. It might seem a strange time to focus on something as minor or even as twee as the nature cure, but I wanted to explore these large-scale, overwhelming, interconnected crises through that really intimate point of contact where we meet the world and where whatever happens to us might be a catalyst for change. This was an approach that seems to be missing from a lot of the mainstream narratives of nature healing I encountered. The images of beautiful, able-bodied white women, arms outstretched, kind of in forest, doing a challenging yoga pose on a beach, project an image of the nature cure that's obviously excluding and ripe for satire. The companies that sell us beauty products, holidays, and clothes know how susceptible we are to the charms of healing nature and how much we're craving it. Glossy magazines and Instagram influencers who promise to make us happy with shopping and meditation are now selling rural retreats, natural remedies and beauty products using language that evokes pristine wilderness, golden countryside and soothing, lapping oceans. But no one can buy happiness or sell a connection to nature. And the promises of wellness culture do more harm than good. Playing into our anxieties, wellness can become just another stick to beat us with, a way to weaponize well-being by blaming people for not being healthy or as happy as they should. Since I began this work, I've seen the language of nature and well-being creep into workplaces as bosses encourage employees to manage their stress by taking a walk or engaging with nature, alluding to the history of forest bathing, which was invented by the Japanese government in the 1980s as a response to a spate of suicides and strokes in the business world caused by overwork. Nature as self-help can obviously be useful for people who are suffering, but without changing the way that business operates. It's never going to be more than a sticking plaster, a way of individualizing and delegating the problems, rather than transforming workplaces or societies so that no one has to seek the forest for well-being as a last resort. Likewise, some of the psychological approaches to nature cure that I've encountered are often alienating. If I had £1 for every sentence I'd read starting with the words, "studies show that," and ending with some nugget of health advice connected to nature, I would be a very rich woman. Are you getting enough vitamin D? Asks one. Are you getting enough vitamin N? Asks one popular health website. Studies show that reduced exposure to nature is linked to a higher risk of obesity, cancer, heart disease, anxiety, and depression, and that stressed women often take the edge off by watching TV, drinking, or eating instead of going for a walk in the park. This kind of language is meant to be inspirational, but it's also punitive and can diminish the seriousness or the chronic nature of many conditions. Pharmaceuticals and psychotherapy save lives, and people living with mental illness can spend years experimenting with the right mix of medicines and therapies to help alleviate symptoms, achieve remission, or simply find a way of living with pain. When we get excited about the way that light, colour, or natural scent affects mood, we're often guilty of treating people as little more than plants that need to be gardened. A drop of magnesium, 8 hours of sun, and 2 inches of water a week, and we will all flourish as told. What I found instead is that this unreflexive positivism doesn't work or fully account for what happens when people go to nature. Our culture, our beliefs, the stories we share, as well as our personal traumas or desires, shape the way we feel and the kinds of connections we yearn for. And of course, nature is not a magic bullet for every condition, and suggesting it can be deeply offensive to people with complex and potentially lifelong mental health problems, who also need and deserve beauty and want a connection with nature, whether it will cure them or not. The major determinants of mental illness are ultimately social, and most people suffer psychological pain because of trauma, poverty, and the effects of inequality. The psychological violence of poverty, racism, sexism, homophobia, and all forms of bigotry and marginalization won't be fixed by love of nature alone. Natural healing, for that reason, needs to be critical. It needs to be socially engaged and environmentally just if it is going to really address the reasons people are becoming unwell and the context in which they seek healing. Finally, what I wanted to discover was if eco-recovery could work both ways. Something that makes me very uncomfortable about nature cure discourse is it's often rather unsophisticated in its understandings of nature itself. As someone who became interested in this topic through literature, I find one-dimensional nature hard to grasp. The cultural critic Raymond Williams proposed that nature is probably the most complex word in the language, and that any full history of the uses of nature would be a history of the large part of human thought. But the idea of healing nature evades this complexity often entirely, reducing rich and diverse cultural and historical understandings of the more than human to a sunny, green, benign retreat, separate from the realities of life and insulated from its harms. It's obvious to blame the Romantic poets for conjuring up a dream of gentle, sympathetic nature, what the philosopher Timothy Morton calls nature TM. Healing Wordsworth's nature as teacher, Virgil's pastoral, and the classical Arcadia, the Garden of Eden, Shakespeare's Forest of Arden, the Shire imagined by Tolkien, or the Isle of Avalon, resting place of King Arthur. These are golden places where people, animals, plants and earth, air and water, the elemental forces of ancient medicine, all coexist in happy sympathy. All of it a green idyll shimmering on the other side of the fence. These stories obviously originate from a Western canon, raising questions about the applicability and meaning of the nature cure beyond Eurocentric cultures. They also erase the dark side of nature that can be found in the old stories too. The god Dionysus, struck mad by Hera and sent to wander in the forest as punishment, or Mad King Sweeney of Irish legend, who was cursed by a saint, traumatized in battle, then fled to the wilds of the forest to bear his pain in the form of a bird. Why should we take only simple, sunny solace from nature? Timothy Morton pushes against this idea, saying, maybe at heart I'm an old-fashioned goth, but every time I hear the word bright, I reach for my sunglasses. Follow that logic and that nature means bright, green, joy, and health, and you'll soon end up believing that sickness and sadness, low mood, and anger somehow take us outside of nature. This is obviously stigmatizing, and it also contradicts so many ancient stories about the alluring gloom of the forest, the fact that nature has been as associated with sadness as it has with joy. The same nature we like to beautify is often not natural at all, but created through long and complex entanglements between people and the more than human. Nature also includes poisons, insects, and extreme weather. Pandemics are just another reminder that nature can't be sectioned off from culture and only visited occasionally when we need a break from our real lives. Nature is in the cells of our bodies, the air we breathe, in beneficial nutrients, as well as viruses and pathogens. When we talk about healing nature, we're telling just part of the story of how enmeshed we are in a living world of what Morton calls strange strangers, as well as the domesticated and familiar. Instead of all this, I was drawn to stories from literature and history that appreciate nature and ecology in all of its complexity from multiple cultural perspectives, including Indigenous environmental perception and marginalized perspectives from within and outside the Western canon. I was interested in stories that represent nature as sites of refuge and resistance. Parks, forests and gardens, beaches, they're places people can escape the bullshit of life for a while. gardening, walking in the forest, or sitting calmly by a lake might help us become less susceptible to negative cycles of thinking. These are also places to feel joy, to experience love, and to organize. Well-being in the hands of the wellness industry can feel like an order to be happy, an obligatory command to cheer up, be productive. But like a connection to nature, a critical attitude to well-being might lead us towards a more just and radical way of life. Nature might be somewhere to practice collective and self-care in the most radical sense possible, as an act of political warfare, in the words of writer and activist Audre Lorde. It sometimes seems perverse to me that we're looking to nature for answers at the moment that our ecosystems are collapsing, our temperature gauge is going off the scale. But maybe that craving for connection represents a new and exciting form of environmentalism, a recognition that our lives and our health are intimately entwined with the fate of the natural world. What I try to do in my book is share stories of people who fought for nature and championed mental health, fighting for the radical possibilities of a nature and well-being movement that isn't just a fleeting trend or kind of privileged treats, but gets to the roots of what it really means to coexist well. So I wanted to give a bit of a summary of what the book is actually about, and it was really hard because there are so many chapters and they each take a different element or environment. There's one chapter on water that looks at this idea of kind of plunging into cold water and the idea of that as creating transformation, but also the elements of self-punishment that are rolled up with the idea of cold immersion. And I kind of think through that to a form of radical self-acceptance. I look at mountains and the idea of transcendence and ecstasy, and then think about what happens if you don't transcend on the mountain, or if for reasons of personal mobility, you can't climb the mountain. What does an engagement with those places actually mean? What does equality in nature look like? On a chapter on forests, I look at fear, my experiences as a woman who loves to walk alone and kind of only really likes to walk alone, of walking in forests and encountering all the ways that I'm objectified or kind of threatened in the natural world. There's a chapter on gardens, a chapter on farms, and the idea of the work cure, and how the kind of classical Georgic blends into the idea of kind of the back to work mentality that's very kind of, that really characterizes contemporary recovery discourse in mental health services. Chapter on virtual nature, a chapter on lost places, places that are being lost, ecological grief, and so on, and thinking about climate change through all of these. So I'm not going to talk about any of them. I'm going to talk about parks instead, because they almost seem impossible to problematize. Everybody loves parks. During the lockdown, obviously, there was a huge amount of discourse about their importance. But I think that the political nature of parks and some of the shortcomings of parks often aren't talked about. It feels almost sacrilegious to do it, so I thought I'd do that here. Ian has some slides to show. Give him a moment to find them. Amazing, thank you. So this slide is of the beautiful campus where I work. I'm very lucky to work here, and I'm very sorry for everything I'm going to say about it and what it represents now, but it is a fabulous place to work. This is on the outskirts of Bath, and it's a very typical 18th century landscape park. You live around Bath, you'll have seen places like this. And I teach courses on environmental crisis and literature, and problematizing this idea of nature. And I used to often take students on a walk around the campus and ask them, where can you see nature? When we came to compare notes at the end, there was very little detail of the landscape that had been missed. The lake, the trees, the hills, the grass, everything was nature. Everything apart from the gravel paths and the wooden benches and the little buggies that the maintenance staff use. Everything was nature with a capital N as far as you could see. The fact that they said that shows that the landscape was still doing its job that it was designed to do. Because as natural as it all seems, the whole layout is artificial. In the 1790s, the aristocratic owners took shovels to the earth, but they didn't personally, they hired people to do it, turning it into a landscape of beauty and pleasure. Hills were raised, streams diverted to fill the valley with a picturesque lake. Trees were cut down so that splendid views could be seen, and a dense border of trees was planted elsewhere to obscure the working terrains of farms and fields beyond. carefully snipping the ugly reality of poverty out of the frame and giving an illusion of extent, freedom of land that went on forever. Designed by Lancelot Capability Brown, one of the most famous and fashionable of the naturalistic landscapers, this is Nature 2.0, inspired by the real thing, but perfected through subtle, elegant design. Brown and his contemporaries were inspired to do this, to transform the land into a picturesque scene, because they were fired up by new ideas about how nature affected us. The picturesque should intrigue, but not stupefy, please, but not overwhelm. Its visual features should move us, producing what William Gilpin called a tranquil pause of mental operation. As Uvedale Price put it, the effect of the picturesque is curiosity. It neither relaxes nor violently stretches the fibers. It was primed to become an ideal landscape for psychological restoration, and its legacy is visible all around the world and in practically every city and major town in the UK, where it informed the design of the city park. So I call them little well-being machines, the city parks, designed to soothe and beguile, restore the energies and calm the nerves. The English landscape park suggests that feelings like nature can be crafted and designed. They were brought into cities in the first decades of the 19th century as the Industrial Revolution took hold. Mushrooming cities ate up the surrounding fields, and people from the countryside crowded into slums to take up positions in factories. Cities became dangerous and dirty, with sanitation and air pollution problems that are now notorious, and people pressed close together in slums. Next slide, please, Ian. The public park, as we know it, and this is my local park, St George's, in East Bristol. The public park as we know it was a product of this moment, a place for sport and recreation to keep workers contented, healthy, and out of trouble. The push to create them didn't come just from trade unionists and social reformers. It was the lawmakers, town councils, and factory owners who began to wring their hands in worry over the health and vigour of urban populations. Some of the most generous funders of the first parks were wealthy industrialists, the same people who employed the workers whose health was, not uncoincidentally, deteriorating in their factories. Others were funded by selling off land around the park's edges, which explains why fancy houses often border parks. Those plots of land were used to raise capital to build the parks. We sometimes think of parks as refuges of untouched nature, left behind as the city developed around it, but often creating a park meant bulldozing whatever was there before. In England, the first places to go were what remained of the commons. Next slide, please, Ian. These were the swathes of open land where, since the Middle Ages, people had claimed the rights to fish and graze animals and cut turf to draw the fundamental means to live. The seizure of the common lands was part of the long process of removing poor people's rights to the land. Without strips to farm or commons to live off, they became roaming seasonal workers, farming for hire and forced to rent at the landowner's rate. It was the descendants of displaced rural folk who migrated to work in factories and cities and ended up using parks to replace the lost greens and commons of their ancestors. Most of the commons had been enclosed and sold off by them. What was left became dangerous for the authorities, providing places for workers to congregate and organise, like Kennington Common, which is pictured here, a muddled ground in South London where 50,000 people congregated for a mass Chartist demonstration in 1848, so a voting right demonstration. Within 4 years of that mass gathering, Kennington Common had been enclosed and gatherings were banned. Railings went up, paths were laid, trees planted. The area turned into a park, which meant it could be subject to new kinds of policing. From now on, working class people could use the open space for leisure and to recover from the exhaustion from work, but not to meet and fight for more. Another striking instance of the park radically reshaping the land is the one that is pictured in the next slide, New York's Central Park. I feel that it's ever so slightly too close to that Boris Johnson talk for me to be saying next slide without feeling ever so slightly embarrassed. But anyway, I'm really grateful to Ian for, for managing these. Yes, New York Central Park. In the 1850s, as urban development crept up the island of Manhattan, city officials began to press for the creation of a grand area of urban greenery to give respite to the exploding population. The first American landscape architect, arguably the first American landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, was the man who got the commission. He vowed to bring the benefits of the landscape park to the masses. He was influenced by Thoreau, he'd read Walden, the Transcendentalists. He had this idea of wilderness as being kind of beneficial, moral, educative, creating moments of ecstasy and personal growth. He'd also read widely in European landscape aesthetics and knew the kind of the English landscape design very well. He believed that park designs should meet deep human needs for restoration and solitude. Their scenery and planting should convey nature's bounty and mystery, producing effects as innately moving as music. When Olmsted brought the landscape park to a rapidly expanding New York, he was setting the standard for a kind of natural beauty that would be valued in a post-independence, post-Civil War America. His Central Park design offers a curiously compressed landscape of lakes and ladies' meadows, castle follies, and the pocket wilderness of the Ramble. So it's kind of almost like a Disneyland of different landscapes and places, all compressed into this relatively small area, considering what it was trying to represent. But what was there before, and what had been lost? When colonial settlers arrived in the 16th century, the Isle of Manahatta, which is the next slide, had been a vibrant ecology of wetlands and waterways. The Isle of Many Hills, which was home to the Lenape indigenous people, and a habitat of wolves, black bears, and mountain lions. Long before the lawns of Central Park were laid, these traces were destroyed as indigenous land was divided up between merchant families, and the haunts of beavers, tree frogs, and bog turtles forgotten. Gone too were all traces of Seneca Village. The next slide, please. This is a community of freed slaves, property-owning Black and Irish families who started to acquire land on the site in the mid-1820s. Supplied with fresh spring water and the rare privilege of voting rights, the village was cleared to make way for the long column of restorative greenery that would become Central Park. But it raises questions about what other kinds of stories of nature and well-being we might be telling if this unique multicultural community had not been obliterated. In spite of the often painful history of their creation, parks are still considered the most perfect form of urban nature and the most serene landscape for natural restoration. Next picture, please. Next slide. Growing green as an oasis in a desert of concrete and exhaust fumes, parks are used to beautify cities and create salutogenic environments, which means healthful environments, places that support and encourage healthy behavior like exercise, provide places to disengage from stress and allow humans to be well. Armed with data about how we respond to nature, town planners and public health experts set up pocket environments to encourage certain kinds of behavior that are shown to be good for the health of communities and cities, and of course for their economics as well. Criticizing parks feels unthinkable and sacrilegious, but many parks aren't exactly perfect for people or for nature. A good park can be a refuge for animals, but the quality and biodiversity of parks varies enormously, from leafy expanses with fresh running water to a barren island circumnavigated by fuming rivers of traffic, as Rachel Cusk puts it in one of her London novels. Next slide, please. I'm originally from edges of London, lived in London, so I know these London parks have their value. I have kind of clawed my way to them on many days, and you can tell how much they mean to people by the way they flock to them on lunch breaks, hot days, desperate for even the foggiest and most tired patch of green. But they can be grim sites of sufficient solace, offering just enough nature for people and a precarious refuge for wildlife and ecology. Lawns have started to dry up each year, even in the UK with the now inevitable climate-induced heat wave. while millions of gallons of water are wasted preserving parkland aesthetics that were imported with colonialism and the globalization of English picturesque aesthetics to some of the driest places on Earth. I'm thinking of places like Florida, Australia, and South Africa. At the heart of the problem seems to be the way that parks have reduced nature to a design. Next slide, please. Reduce them to a design, to an aesthetic, which in the hyper-efficient logic of the modern city has been further streamlined to a simple capitalist equation, what the planners call green space. So green space is the most commonly used word in any kind of nature and well-being science or any kind of policy. It's always green space or sometimes blue space to talk about water. And it can mean lots of different things. It can mean lots of different types of environment, not necessarily sort of a rubbishy patch of lawn. But I'm going to sort of take issue with green space. You look at any plan for a new housing development and you'll see glossy images with green squares of grass and trees like puffs of cotton candy. Their existence adds a drop of green to a concrete design, but it doesn't guarantee these places are valuable habitats, places where people or living creatures want to be, where birds and wild plants and insects might make their home. The risk with using green space as a shorthand for all urban nature is that it can become just that, a blank green cutout square, a space on a map, devoid of beauty, meaning, biodiversity, or life. Next slide, please. In the course of conducting this research, I went to really lovely places and I went to really rubbish places as well. And some of the most rubbish places I went to were green spaces. This is Mill Park in Cambridge, which is a big, very expensive development by the railway station that crammed a lot of flats together, created lots of different social problems, but connected to those was this shared green space in the middle, this lawn that was kind of everybody's back garden. And just, it was built in a way that it simply couldn't live, it couldn't be used efficiently. Lots of different people's needs could not kind of interweave in this place. And ecologically, it was very kind of broken and ruined as well and had to be completely redesigned. Another place I looked at, should be the next slide, Tidal Gardens, which was an amazing place. It was an absolute joy to visit that in Deptford, which was a kind of a beautiful, biodiverse, flourishing community, woodland and garden in the heart of this like just outrageously built up area, low income, very ethnically diverse area surrounded by major roads. So a lot of traffic pollution in that area and a lot of people living in flats without any sort of space of their own. This was unfortunately demolished in 2019 to make way for flats, for kind of part of the gentrification of the area. If you could jump to the next slide. Yeah, there was protests there was an occupation, there was years of campaigning. Next slide, please. It's interesting to see them using the term green space, which was sort of, so the problem really with this discourse was protesters were told by the developers, well, there's lots of problems, but the protesters were told by the developers not to complain because they'd located a green space locally that they could use. But this turned out to be, the next slide, a strip of grass verge running alongside the noisy, polluted A road, speckled with cigarette ends and dog shit. So people who were using this area were kind of given their fabulous garden was taken away from them and they were offered green space instead, which really illustrates the problems. In both of these cases, someone somewhere was able to tick a box that said the housing or the area has green space and they had done their job. I focused on London and Cambridge, and this might seem like a first world problem, but it's a fact that inner city communities, who are often the most economically vulnerable and ethnically diverse, have less access to nature, even nature of a kind of really low quality, and whose green spaces are vulnerable to being paved out of existence. With nature reduced to a simple mark or a map or a fleck of green on a planner's design, urban communities are left with just enough nature, the bare minimum, to breathe, play, dream, live and unwind. Some things have given me kind of hope or kind of the shape of what a kind of real ecological recovery might look like. This will be the next slide. This is a paper I was really excited to be a co-author on with all these scientists. We co-wrote it over multiple days in this huge room, and there were people from the World Health Organization there were community gardeners there was a gut biome expert there. And everybody was kind of trying to get beyond this simple kind of sunny green nature idea to think about biodiversity, and actually how biodiversity and the flourishing of the natural environment, like real ecological recovery, is essential for health. It's not just like looking at something that's green and kind of instrumentalizing it and cheering up. And so much interesting research was captured in this paper and in this series of events about how wetland plants and mollusks and reed beds upstream from the kinds of water that flow into cities, they filter the water, they create cleaner and more biodiverse environments. How the more complex and various the tree cover in a city is, the more air is purified and noise pollution reduced, which makes cities more livable and more beautiful as well. Even the more stimulating environment, the more patterned and textured and flourishing, the more likely it is to promote experiences of awe and wonder and humility. And the scientists were really interested in that. They weren't just like, oh, what's your blood cortisol doing? They were really interested in your actual kind of, very personal responses. Talk about spiritual responses as well. But just generally the way that landscapes make you feel was really captured in this research. Studies into the richness of trees, forests, fish in ponds, and afternoon bird abundances, which is a term I was introduced to, all were kind of factored in. I admit I was quite angry that we needed to do this at all, to prove the worth of so many threatened species by demonstrating how our well-being and survival is entangled with theirs. But it was much better than an economic argument, the kind that governments and town planners find so beguiling. And it's certainly a step towards forcing scientists, town planners, anyone who wants a fair and flourishing future to look beyond just enough nature, kind of the flat aesthetic of green space, to envisage a totally different kind of city park and a different relationship with nature. As I said, the coronavirus lockdown made people newly desperate to be in parks. Like everyone else, I walked out from my house across the silent roads to the old school Victorian park around the corner. Its dingy duck pond was thick with green algae, and the kids' playgrounds and tennis courts were locked. But the lawns were covered with friends and families seeking pleasure, connection, normality, a place to drink and despair, or a place to be safe for a little while outside their homes. When we demand more nature in cities, we need to demand more than just green space. We need to fight for biodiversity and ecology, for equality and access, to care about the quality of water, the liveliness of habitats, and the long-term sustainability and ownership of parks. Living through the lockdown and seeing how people in built-up cities suffered through lack of access to wide green space made many people want to see things change urgently, like the miles of land wasted on golf courses and private estates being reclaimed for public use. It also convinced me that we need to see beyond the picturesque nature TM beauty of the park and value places that promote biodiversity and link the city to wider ecologies of water systems and animal migration routes. In their reflection on the horrors and the human costs of the Anthropocene, Anna Singh and Dora Haraway have both spoken of the need to create and sustain refugia, places of refuge for people and other critters. As climate change worsens, parks are going to need to be refugia for humans and non-humans alike. What would it mean to have a wetland in a city park, or animals grazing, or places to pick fruit, or to turn city streets into forests where people learn about the natural processes that make the earth truly livable? It might mean that we fight not just for green space in the city, but for ecology itself, be empowered to play a part in its future. If we can release ourselves from the notion that only the little well-being machine of the landscape park can truly restore us, or that the flat aesthetic of green space is just good enough, it might open up possibilities of finding other flourishings of nature beautiful, ones that are more biologically rich, ecologically suited to the very hard times ahead. People who care about the environment are often accused of being joyless and ascetic, but this makes me feel greedy for life. I don't want just enough nature. I want more. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. One of the advantages of the virtual world is that we can all be joining you from the comfort of our homes, but the disadvantage is you don't get any acclaim. There are no applause, there's no loud cheers. But thank you for a really kind of thought-provoking, and I think whatever people's questions might be, I think you've made us think twice about our own relationship with green space and that term itself. So I'm going to ask people whether they want to ask questions. We have one question in the chat, which I will come to in a moment. But if there anybody else who wants to raise a hand, either using the raise hand function under participants, or I will move to the view so I can see if people have are waving at me. In nobody waving at the moment, but let's start then with the question that was in the chat, which was from someone whose name comes up as an abbreviation rather than as a name. So Slay3, and I'm just going to read this, and if they want to follow up on this verbally, then they're very welcome to switch on their camera or audio and amplify what they were wanting to say. But this comment is picking up on your use of critical and being critical, never more critically important, is a quote from what you've just said. But would creative thinking not open up to improvement? So I think behind that is a question about the place of creativity in the kind of criticism or the critique that you are making of the wellness culture, or more specifically here of urban space.
Yeah, I guess they're kind of a dialectic, aren't they? That I often begin with critique and listing. It took me so long to even start doing this work, so I was like, there are so many contradictions. I'm just overwhelmed with contradictions, and I don't know how to think through them, because there was a lot of stuff that was really disturbing me and felt very neoliberal and very politically unreflexive and very complacent about the nature and wellbeing world. And then I was going to events and meeting people, practitioners in particular, who knew all too well all of the terrible social conditions in which they work in terms of funding and the mental health service funding, the lives of patients or service users or volunteers they were working with, and the fact that they were doing this work in very, very difficult circumstances and with very little reward. So I was very kind of torn between wanting to be critical and to flag up the things that I didn't think were working, whereas at the same time wanting to champion those people and to celebrate this moment of connection. And I think that the emphasis on critique in this talk is because there's that need to just clear away so much stuff to begin with before something else can emerge. And I hope in the book that the shape of the chapters, I hope, does that more and kind of gives more space for creative thinking and more collaborative thinking to flourish.
Thank you, Sam. Terry.
Sam, thank you very much for that. There's really a lot to think about there. You've given us quite a grade of a range of qualities of the nature of spaces, but do you have anything to say about the range of qualitative experiences of nature? I mean, the difference between a fell runner moving as fast as possible over the fells with a bird watcher meditating quietly and somebody just lying in water in wild water swimming, just lying, doing nothing. Do you have anything to say about qualitative experience of nature?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. I think that in editing this, I basically took my writing, which is like half, I went into the park, you know, like half my experience, and then half the like political stuff. And I was like, I've only got time for the political stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of reflection on like embodiment and experience, and how, like I say, like the experience. In the forest chapter, I talk about walking in Bristol and feeling a certain way, and looking at the forest in a certain way, and then a woman comes up to me and says, "Aren't you scared to be here by yourself?" Which is a really weird question, and the way that that changes the quality of the experience and produces completely different affect, and makes the place look very different as well. I'm interested in particular in the difference between like working in environment and kind of ownership of land, and how that changes your relationship as opposed to kind of moving through it, like in a mountain park. And in the mountain chapter, I talk a lot about like the experience of being in the mountains and not climbing them, the experience of being in the mountains and just sitting, you know, as opposed to climbing. So I'm really, really interested in that stuff. It's just, it was cold, unfortunately, in this talk. I mean, certainly for parks, you know, the aesthetics of sound and air quality and things like that are so important to how they work. And the idea of the planting of trees that were that was used in the original landscape parks to make it look like your property went on forever, they're used as sound barriers and also kind of psychological barriers in cities to make people feel like they've got this little space of kind of little haven. So I think that embodied experience of parks is really interesting as well.
Thanks.
We have a question in the chat from Jill. Do you think that the mental health issues that are increasing due to the current lockdowns will encourage governments, and I presume she also means local authorities and planners, to consider more biodiverse spaces in planning?
I mean, I think they should, absolutely, and I don't think it should have taken a lockdown for that to happen. It's really interesting, the lockdown thing, because like I know that some of the arguments, and this isn't to understate the terrible mental health burden of the lockdown, but I saw reporting recently from a mental health charity saying that the claims that lockdown increased the suicide rate was actually completely overstated, didn't affect it at all. So I worry sometimes around the kind of anti-lockdown lobby using mental health as a guard for keeping the economy open and kind of putting people at risk, you know, in a different way from health perspective. But yeah, I don't think the lockdown will in itself. I really don't think the government, particularly this government, will do anything simply for the good of nature or people. I think we really need to fight for these things. I don't think that they will, simply because it seems obvious and right from a climate change perspective or a public health perspective. And participating in that paper with that group of people was really interesting because, you know, there are people from the World Health Organization there, people from the UN, people from all around the world. And the level of work you have to do to just say it matters that there are some living birds in the city, the fact that that level of research needs to be done, these multi-people papers and all of this expertise came together to prove it, suggests that it's not going to happen without a fight. But I'm happy to fight for that.
Stephen, you have your hand virtually raised.
Hi, Sam. Thank you first for this absolutely brilliant talk. I'm really looking forward to the book. I'm really intrigued by your comments about green. It's my favourite colour, but I think the word green is so often used that it has to be good. And we know, of course, that green farmland, the greener it is, the worse it is. But another word I'd really like your comments on is the word brownfield, which is always used as we must build on brownfield, not on green spaces. And of course, we don't want housing estates on parks and on beautiful nature reserves. But brownfield is always used as this, whereas a lot of brownfield is extremely good for nature simply because it's been neglected. So I wondered if you had any thoughts just about the use of that word and the juxtaposition of brown and green in that term.
Yeah. It's got real, like, this sceptred isle, like green and pleasant land quality about it, doesn't it? And it feels very Northern European, very British in a way. And one of the things I talk about in the parks chapter is about how a lot of the research into the aesthetics of like the ideal soothing environment, people like Roger Ulrich who are researching this, they end up with something that looks a lot like a landscape park, which is so weird when you think that there are so many people in the world who grew up around deserts or ice or mountains or environments that aren't green at all. Why this kind of like micro representation of pastoral Southern English landscape would be this kind of universally pleasing aesthetic is very strange. In terms of brown field, yeah, that's so interesting. I'm sure you know a lot more about this than I do. I've not seen those arguments. I'm going to look into them immediately. But yeah, that sense that like if anything doesn't fit this very specific aesthetic that's quite recent, really, but has become so dominant that it almost looks natural. It's naturalistic. It's become natural. That things like wetlands or moors or places that don't fit that are of no ecological value and hence can be destroyed, whilst still being some of the most ecologically useful landscapes. I'm thinking peat bogs and things like that. It's interesting to think about that in terms of brown fields, because they're often post-industrial or post-agricultural landscapes. And the idea that recovery might be in those landscapes is very interesting. It's making me think of Anna Singh and her work on industrial forests and mushrooms and the idea of how you recover these places. That wasn't a very good answer, but it's a really good question. I'm going to think about it a lot more.
Well, thank you. No, I think it's really to do with the fact that they, as you said, they're brown because they've been neglected, because they're post-industrial, and so many of the sites that we love, and wetlands are a great example. Almost every wetland in Britain is a post-industrial site. It's a gravel pit or a peat dig or whatever. But yeah, it's an interesting area, isn't it?
Thank you, Stephen.
A question from the chat from Chris, who also commended you on a great talk. He recently read I recently read the Environment Bill, was struck by the term nature capital and its centrality in the bill. Feels like a step in a particular neoliberal direction, which worries me, and echoes some of the points you are making. Any thoughts on this and the ways or activism avenues that might be used to push back?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. My colleague Sean Sullivan has written a really good blog post, a very full blog post that's a critique of natural capital language. So I'd urge anybody interested to look that up, because she says it a lot better than I will. But when I started doing this research, it was in collaboration with the wildlife trusts, who were trying to get a Nature and Wellbeing Act passed for it was England and Wales, to restore natural environments for the benefit of people's well-being. And it was the first moment in policy that like these two worlds of conservation and kind of mental health and thinking about well-being were really being pulled together. And that document, whilst being really radical actually and really exciting, I think it never happened, because we got the Tory government in 2015 and nobody expected that, and the whole thing was junked. But that used the language of natural capital, and yet it's really disturbing, because it takes ecosystem service thinking, which is a way of kind of attributing value to natural environments, which might be spiritual value or cultural value or like social value or economic value, in order to protect them and kind of classify them in policy conversations and kind of defend them to governments. It takes that ecosystem services thinking, which is already like open to critique, and then it just takes the economic argument. It really, I think it highlights the financial value of nature. And yeah, and I mean, I'm sort of copying what Sian says here, because she points it out so well, but the problem is what if you can't assign value to something? What happens to that environment? Does it get junked? What if we can't work out the ecological relations between things? We're really bad at working out how nature works, how ecology works. Who are we to think that we can assign value and determine how this complex web of life interlinks so that we can sort of save or junk it? And in terms of mental health, it's really problematic as well. and I look at in the book economic arguments for the nature cure. So the idea that public health should invest in forest bathing or farming because it saves the public, the taxpayer, this much each year. You know, how problematic that is as a logic if it's imported into mental health services as well, that suddenly people are only worth investing in as like human capital, basically. So yeah, I push back on every possible avenue. And in terms of mental health, recovery in the bin is a really interesting psychiatric survivor group who push back up against that. And Sean's blog post would be a really good place to look, just to look at that argument and avenues and ways to push back.
Sam, can I invoke my privilege as chair to ask a question, which comes a little bit from your own kind of international experiences, and most of the examples that you were giving were British or maybe just English and American, and a particular kind of American. And I just wonder whether, to what extent, I mean, you've been a research fellow in Germany, which has its own distinctive history in this regard, but also, you know, there are other parts of, just if we take just Europe. Do you think there's anything that we can learn, and you can define we however you wish, from the way that, say, other countries are thinking about the relationship between the urban, the non-urban, about individual and social interaction with the natural world? And do you think that, are there things, are lessons that we can learn elsewhere that you think would speak to the kind of critique you've been given?
Yeah, definitely. I was really lucky to spend 6 months in Munich, and I don't know, I mean, I've not lived in other German cities and not even visited that many other German cities, but every German city I've visited, it's been very easy to swim, like almost immediately in the city. Very clear water, lots of kind of provisions, or even if there aren't provisions, a big culture of public swimming. And where I lived in Munich, I was near the Englischer Garden, which is a garden on English design, and has all these little landscape features. It was really weird to be there, having come from like Bath and Newton Park and so on. But they diverted the very, it's a very kind of wide river that flows into Munich, and they diverted a channel of it through the park. And people just jump into it, like no one cares. All the rules and bylaws and the ways that we use public space in England, like they really didn't care. People were naked in the park as well. There's a kind of big culture of kind of nudism and this idea of kind of being healthful, to be in the sun and to swim, which I didn't get into that quite so much, but I respected it. And so I think I definitely learn a lot about demanding clear water and just water standards in England. I'm a big outdoor swimmer, and I know that when I get into the river near me in Bristol, it's polluted. Like I know most of the rivers and waterways around here are polluted to some extent. And that's something that the kind of culture of wild swimming that's become very fashionable in the last few years, I'd love to see that become more of an activist culture, in the same way as like Surfers Against Sewage, for example, campaigns against sea pollution, to get wild swimmers involved in campaigning for water protection. Be really great. Other places, I didn't do as much traveling as I would have liked because of the old lockdown, and also I didn't have the money to, and I didn't want to do lots of flying for this. So most of my examples are quite European, and when I'm writing about other places, I'm writing about them. Like I write about farming in Botswana, or I write about America, but that's textual history. But yeah, certainly anything involving kind of cooperative farming traditions, use of public space, and kind of natural, or like a more of a culture of environmental protection, I think we could learn a lot from.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? We are approaching 20 to 9, and I realise it's a Monday evening, but any other questions, whether in the chat or in I'm scanning through. Jane has asked, with the interest in nature cure, is there a danger that people will only come to see nature as a human benefit rather than humans being part of nature and understanding their place within nature?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the thing, like one of my big objections I spent a long time worrying about was this idea of using nature as a tool, basically, to make us feel better, and then just kind of like it's somewhere you go to and then you come back from. And I think that landscape parks and even nature reserves, to some extent, as you know, as brilliant as they are and essential as they create that very binary thinking of it's something we go to and then we kind of come away from. So in the book and in my thinking about this, I try to always look at the point at which what we do to improve our health absolutely the health of nature is kind of problematic language, but isn't ecologically damaging, is kind of ecologically regenerative in some way. So things like, you know, organic farming methods, or like small scale farming, cooperative farming, things that that undo damage and further kind of just completely integrate that relationship between ecological health and human health is really, those were the stories, those were the moments I was looking for. Because yeah, the worst thing about, you know, the nature and well-being, like most of these, like, well-being begins as a radical movement. It begins as a movement to say, hey, GDP isn't the only way to, you know, value a country's worth. We need to look at the well-being of populations. It begins as something radical, and then it's turned into, or kind of appropriated and turned into something, you know, that you have to do for yourself. Go and make yourself be well by going to nature. And likewise, the worst thing ever would be if the nature cure was turned into something like that. So yeah, keep it critical and creative. Keep it radical.
Thank you. Any other questions, or are we perhaps we're all very keen to go out into the night and experience a little bit of nature, although it's not quite as wild a night as it has been, but all right, I think if I don't see any other hands raised, so I will we'll wrap up things there. But thank you so much for to you, Sam, for an excellent paper and a really one designed to make us think. And I think the what it was, the talk was kind of a model of, was that way of being able to talk about academic research in a way that is, you know, relevant and engaging for people outside of academia. And I think we forgive you as a city of parks for making us think again about what a park means. And we all very much look forward to your book. Does that mean, you said you were going to go back and doing researching, does that mean that it's you've still got time before the final deadline to do some revisions?
Well, it was in last week and it's with the editors now. And I'm hoping
okay. So there's
I don't think I can fit any more in. I can probably cut things.
So
in July.
So thank you. You should make sure that you stay on and look into the chat, because there are lots of people. Thank you for a great talk. But I just want to say on behalf of all of the attendees here, and very grateful to them for joining us. We want to warmly thank you for your time and your presentation. So thank you, Sam, and thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again at a future Brilsey talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for chairing, Ian. When's the next talk?